Good afternoon, everybody from New York, and welcome to today's session. My name's Greg Rattray. I'm a senior adjunct researcher at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, as well as I've had the privilege to be the executive director of this version of the New York Cyberattack Task Force, which is issuing its report today on enhancing readiness for national cyber defense through operational collaboration. We will, discuss the report deeply over the next 90 minutes, and it is posted online at Columbia SIPA's site, and there is social media happening, including Twitter right now, and the link to the report is there. But before we get started, I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that this report launch is the start of the 2021 Nigel Roden Global Digital Futures Policy Forum, a program that has been going on here at SIPA for a number of years. And the theme of the forum this year is saving cyberspace. And it will be present through the three sessions that we have planned over the course of the spring. The next session will be a discussion on the future of the internet, along with including a fireside chat with Brad Smith of Microsoft, and a discussion on US-Japan cyber collaboration coming in April. We've been holding the forum since 2015, and clearly the digital and cyber landscape has changed dramatically, as we'll talk about, and we thank the Nigel Roden family for supporting this subject area and helping drive the school's work and research forward. Additionally, we'd like to thank NBC Universal and Michael Bradshaw in particular, who has helped their support for the program and was a participant here on the task force. I will return shortly as part of the panel and provide some background on the task force. I will remind everybody or ask everybody as we move into the discussion portion of this a little bit later that we'll use the Q&A function for questions, and Dean Jana will be the moderator for that session. But before we do that, I'm going to introduce Admiral Dennis Blair, the former Director of National Intelligence and Commander of Pacific Command. Admiral Blair had a 34-year career in the Navy, and we've been lucky to have him as a senior advisor here to the New York Cyber Task Force. He's currently the Knott Professor of Practice at the University of North Carolina and an active director and advisor on a number of global organizations. So with that, sir, I'd have you give us some opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Greg, and good afternoon to everyone, at least everyone on East Coast time. It's a pleasure to be here. I was happy to participate in this study along with Admiral Mike Rogers, former Commander of U.S. Cyber Command, Director of National Security Agency. We both think this is a very important contribution to improving our cybersecurity. It's been really 25 years now since I've been seriously concerned about the threat of very cyber-capable enemies attacking the United States government, military, private sector, through the World Wide Web on which we've come to depend, both in the private sector and in the government, and certainly in the armed forces. During those 25 years, I've seen tremendous and heartening progress in the United States improving its cybersecurity capacity, improving its defensive capability. We now have thousands of skilled cyber defenders. They're in government, they're in the private sector, they're in think tanks, they're in universities. You only have to attend the RSA conference or DEF CON or Black Hat, and you'll feel the energy, the skills, the sheer size of the cybersecurity community, both in this country and in like-minded countries that we work with around the world. And so in addition to that very important human capacity, we've also seen progress in both the national and in some cases the international structure of cybersecurity organizations. We've seen the development of ISACs within the private sector. We've seen the FBI cyber division grow dramatically. We've seen the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agencies, CISA, moving into an important role. We've seen the establishment of Cyber Command itself in the Department of Defense, and we've seen the NSA's growing outreach to many of the both public and private organizations that work in cybersecurity to make the country safer. So although the pace of human capacity development, the pace of organizational development is never as fast as it could be or should be, until fairly recently, I had a reassuring sense of progress, a sense that our defenses were closing the gap on the threat to our economy, our armed forces, our government. But my optimism, I have to say, has been shaken in the past year or so. About a year ago, the Solarium Commission reported to us with a judgment that said in very frank terms, and let me quote it, "A major cyber attack on the nation's critical infrastructure and economic system would create chaos and lasting damage exceeding that wreaked by fires in California, floods in the Midwest, and hurricane in the Southeast." It turned out that this was more than just a attention-grabbing executive summary statement from one more blue ribbon commission, because at the same time that the Solarium Commission was actually writing those reports, a Russian government skilled team of hackers were installing backdoors in SolarWinds Orion software updates that were in coming weeks installed by some 18,000 private companies and government departments and agencies across this country and probably further. And these backdoors were undoubtedly the path for implanting additional thousands, tens of thousands of APTs that will take years to find and eliminate. And by the time that's done, new and more creative attacks will be devised and deployed. So here we are in the cybersecurity environment of 2021. On the positive side, there certainly is awareness. There certainly is concern. It's at an all-time high. Both leaders, public and private leaders, and the public know that this threat is severe. And as I said earlier, we now have the talent, both within and outside of government, to deal with this threat. We have a large number of very skilled cyber defenders who can take on this important fight. We have a full range of centers of excellence in both the private and public sectors that have the skills and the charters to play very important roles. But what we have lacked, what has really been missing, is an overall established, trained national structure that goes across the public and private sectors, that can exchange information, assess our readiness, react rapidly to threats like SolarWinds when they occur. And this is where I believe that the recommendations of this task force are so important. This concept of a national cyber response network is absolutely correct and long overdue. And all of the other recommendations that we'll discuss later today that flow from that, identifying contingencies, assessing readiness, training, exercising, rolling back the results of those exercises into an improved system. All of those flow from this central concept, and they really are long overdue. So I believe that this task force is rolling out a really big and important central idea with very strong supporting recommendations. And I think the challenge for those of us who are on the call, who are on this webinar today, is to do whatever we can to turn these good recommendations into the reality of real capability which can make sure that this country takes advantage of all of the tremendous capabilities from working together, the World Wide Web, the data networks, and so on, without exposing huge vulnerabilities, which can wipe out all of those advantages in just a few weeks of work by a small and dedicated hostile adversary. So I'm anxious to hear the discussion of the task group. We've got a great panel to do it, and I would now like to turn the microphone over to Dean Merritt Jano, who has been the driving force behind Columbia University's very strong role in this and very many other important national security issues. Dean Jano.
Thank you. There is always such a moment in every webinar. Let us hope it's the only one. Admiral Blair, thank you so much for your contributions to this report and to the working group, and for being with us today. As mentioned by Greg Crabtree, we started about 7 years ago undertaking an annual Digital Futures Forum looking at the challenges facing the United States and the world as a result of digital transformations. And a centerpiece of that has been ongoingly a focus on cybersecurity, as well as on the digital economy and internet governance. SIPA is a school that's 75 years old and has from its early days recognized the importance of developing capacity around international security and international affairs. In the years of my deanship, I have felt it was very important for that to naturally evolve to include expanded awareness around cybersecurity, just inescapably so, and to do that in a very interdisciplinary way, not siloed in one area, but across thinking about the effects of the digital economy, digital transformations across many of our core fields. And this annual forum has evolved over time, and this year, as outlined by Greg Crabtree, we're going to be doing a series of events focused on both domestic and international dimensions. I want to add that what we're doing today is really outlining, unveiling, if you will, an intensive work product of a task force that's been working now for quite some time, and that builds on the New York Cyber Task Force that was established in 2017 and developed a, I think, quite influential report on building a defensible cyberspace directed by Jason Healy, a senior research scholar at SIPA. And now, over the past year, in this second effort, the task force has been building on the accomplishments and insights of the first report to think about how the US government and the private sector can enact improvements to develop effective approaches to operational collaboration. And I want to extend my gratitude to all of the task force members, and in particular to Greg Crabtree, who served as executive director of this effort, and really looking forward to this discussion. I think as you read the report, you will see that the report looks to the future and tries to anticipate the kind of severe shocks that adversaries, could present in the cyber realm, and asks, what is our readiness to deal with those shocks? And it identifies both drivers, and it uses scenarios to reveal vulnerabilities and our readiness to deal with them. I like this methodology. I don't think you have to agree with every element of every scenario to find it a useful way of revealing gaps and raising important questions. And I think what it shows is that we are still missing a great deal in this nation to respond to very plausible shocks that we could experience. I think this is what Admiral Blair is speaking to, is our continued vulnerabilities that require the United States to make significant investments to build a properly robust system, and it's going to be very, very difficult. And even in sectors that have long been on the front lines, I think the ability of the private sector and the government to work together is underdeveloped. And in thinking to the future, it's really very important to correct those deficiencies. And that's what this recommendations here try to identify. What kind of responses are needed that could involve, all key stakeholders and offer the possibility of sustaining readiness at the kind of level needed to develop what could be considered national cyber resiliency. So I think we have an amazing group of people with us today. We'll start with remarks by Greg Rattray, who I have already mentioned and you've met in our webinar this afternoon. He's an adjunct senior research scholar at SIPA, but he also has extraordinary depth of experience in the Air Force, in the White House, in the private sector, and working with the academia as well. Michael Daniel, who's president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, and also comes to us with enormous experience in the National Security Council. Erica Borgard, who is a resident senior fellow at New America Engagement Initiative at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. She's also part of the Solarium Commission that was referenced, and inescapably, Erica, as a Columbia PhD, will have to underscore that today. And Salila Salahuddin, who's the cybersecurity policy lead at Facebook, and I see has just extraordinary background on the Hill with the Judiciary Committee and is a lawyer. Thank you all so much for being with us. So each will offer some initial remarks. We'll have an exchange, and then we'll open it up. So please have your questions coming in, as mentioned in the Q&A function. Greg, I invite you to lead us off.
Right. What we decided to do is, knowing that it's quite a meaty report and we're just releasing it, is to just walk people through the sort of top level of the work we did and, some of the key conclusions, though both Admiral Blair and Dean Janow have hit on really the core essence of things. So I will try to keep this brief, also probably focus on some of the things that I think are most essential to the work we've done. The next slide, please. So just for those who would need to know a little bit more about the task force itself, I mean, it's been mentioned, this is the second instantiation of the task force. Jay Healy led the first one, and Meredith and I actually had the opportunity to participate in that one as well. But it convenes business, technology, policy, and academic leaders and experts. I think it's at both categories. And really, one of the focal points for it is to bring a business-oriented people that operate, in the economy, create and operate critical infrastructures into the dialogue with policymakers and then with technologists, where a lot of the cybersecurity dialogue, in my estimation, does occur in Washington. It does take a technological focus, but as you'll hear in our remarks this afternoon and hopefully the discussion, we think these are national efforts, and the private sector is essential and on the front lines for some of the challenges we've laid out. So we hope that the task force brings a really unique perspective into the national dialogue on these things. I would go to the next slide. So the slide is in the report as well. It really just sort of talks through, though Merit hit on it, the methodology we used. We did start by trying to look at and look forward. And I think one of the things that is different in the approach that we took is it's very much a look forward as to challenges and how well prepared we are and what we need to do to get ready, as opposed to looking at the current state of things. So we hope that's additive to the good work of the Solarium Commission and many that have gone before us. But we use the experts to look at what drivers would be important. And then, as Merritt mentioned, design the scenarios. So we'll look at the scenarios here in a second. And as has been mentioned, it's not about the specific scenarios. The scenarios were a mechanism for us to look at the challenges that we faced. And then we use this methodology that's sometimes called the day after methodology, where we put ourselves in the crisis that we might be project from the scenario, and then went back and took a look at what we would do now. And that resulted in the findings that you'll see in here this afternoon and in the report itself. Next slide. So again, these are the key categories of drivers in the scenarios. I won't go into them in depth, but we did very consciously try to map each of the drivers into different challenges posed in the scenarios. I hope that when people get a chance to take a look at the report, they will get a chance also to look at the appendix. The drivers and the scenarios are laid out in more depth in the appendix. And in that material, we hope is really the type of things we call for in our recommendations too when we talk about contingencies. But it's a first order effort at looking at the types of things that we need to be ready for, and in plan based on contingencies or scenarios that we may encounter. So I think this work was important in and of itself and is worth taking a look at. Next slide, please. If we look at the sort of findings, so again, I mentioned we did a series of workshops around those scenarios, and this has been highlighted. But as Admiral Blair sort of led into, this concern that we're not ready for national security level challenges, and I do think we made a very conscious decision in the task force to look at that higher end, national security risk. We also did have a discussion about whether we should do a look at global operational collaboration and recognize that cyberspace is global and that borders are porous in this regard. We felt like we'd be able to focus better if we looked at the US, though we're hoping the report's approach with a public-private focus is really illustrative for our partners and around the globe, and may even become sort of a model for where we can plug in globally, in addition to a national cyber response network here in the United States. We, as has been mentioned, we didn't feel like we had a focal point for coordinating the readiness effort. While we have had a lot of work on cybersecurity in the government and in the private sector, the notion of a focal point across the nation, I think, is something that we stress, and I'll get into that a little bit here in a second. And that, that as we build a response system, we actually have to assess it and strengthen it. And that critically, this involves the private sector, the technology industry, and especially critical infrastructure operators as real national security partners. We can get into some of the details that we explored in the scenarios and in the experiences that some of the task force members have had up to this point in time. But that, shoulder to shoulder is a term I use in terms of how the private sector, who will really be the front line for these attacks, need to be partnered with the national security community. Next slide. So with that, these are the 5 principal recommendations. Admiral Blair hit on really sort of 2, 3, the need for the network. I will, go back up to recommendation 1 and just say that my personal belief and a finding of the task force is that we need to look and seriously challenge ourselves with what we use the sort of boundary conditions of severe but plausible conditions for our scenarios. As a former military officer myself, and having served in the private sector, working with the government on readiness for cyber issues, that the identification of what contingencies and how severe they should be drives the degree of investment and readiness we need to achieve. So I think that that's something that this report really focuses on. It's present in the work of the Solarium Commission. We do have Erica Borghardt here, and she'll speak to it, the Commission's work as it relates to this. But we partnered early on with the Solarium Commission, and we do believe we're building on a number of things that they've talked about. One of the things that we decided to do was not to focus a lot on how to organize specific departments and agencies within the executive branch, but we were strongly supportive of the notion of a national cyber director and an office of the national cyber director, and that being the focal point that we thought was missing in terms of the bridge public-private. And I also want to mention across levels of government, we had a strong participation from New York City Cyber Command in our work. We talked a lot about the fact that this is a state and local responsibility governmentally, as well as a national responsibility. I think if we've learned a lot of things over the past year, but as we've gone through the pandemic, which is we were just moving into as this task force started, we learned that our government needs to function at all levels. And I think cyber is an area where that is going to be particularly true if we have a severely stressful cyber incident. So the fourth and the fifth recommendations, hopefully you'll get a chance to dig in deep on those, is this notion that we don't need just a concept for a national cyber response network, but we have to assess the degree to which we can handle the contingencies we identify and train and exercise, particularly if we're going to be able to work well together right from the start of a serious situation. Next slide, please. I won't go deeply into this in the interest of time and getting both the other panelists and the audience engaged here. We believe these things came out of our discussions, some of which have been long identified in terms of information flows and legal barriers. It's essential that technology, evolution, which is rapid and, is going to be a key element of the cyber risks we have to assume and have to manage. But one of the things I did want to focus on is to build trust and confidence for cyber crisis response. Doing our work in the year of 2020, it came forward all the time that to do good work together, you have to trust each other, and the public will have to trust what the institutions that are trying to respond to these crises have to say. So we put a strong focus on the notion of trust building, which again, I think is different than a lot of what we've seen sort of in commissions and recommendations about national cyber capabilities. So with that, I'll just conclude with saying, in some ways, we're at the start of the second phase of our efforts. Next slide, please. And plan a, pretty strong advocacy effort. There's a number of entities listed on the slide who have already agreed to, help us disseminate the findings and discuss them further. And we do plan to strongly engage the executive branch, Congress, and then the business leadership in the technology sector and national business forums as we drive forward. If you get a chance to read the report, hope you find the argument compelling, which is that, the cyber readiness is necessary and we don't have it, so that the time to start is now. I'll leave it at that, and Merit, turn it over to you to take us through the remainder of the panel.
Thank you very much. I think you will find in the chat function a link to the report and the executive summary. We're getting that question in, so please take a note of that, and then you'll be able to read it even as we're speaking. With that terrific overview and introduction, let me invite Erica to take us forward.
Great, thank you, Dean Jano, and thank you to my fellow panelists and my colleagues on the New York Cyber Task Force. So as Greg mentioned, I came to this task force from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And so I thought that it would be useful today if I share my perspective, having served on that commission as well as on the New York Cyber Task Force, about how our task force sort of took a number of the core recommendations that the Solarium Commission advocated for, especially those having to do with operational collaboration, and then incorporated them into the scenario testing process and sort of articulated our view, and by our I mean the New York Cyber Task Force, on how they could be sort of implemented and further fleshed out and expanded. And so just to give you some brief background, because I don't want to take up too much time, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was established by Congress in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. The purpose of the commission was to develop a comprehensive strategy as well as a set of policy recommendations to help improve the defense of the United States in cyberspace. And a core part of the commission's work, which is what the New York Cyber Task Force ultimately sort of took and ran with, was improving how the government and the private sector can do a better job of working together to defend the nation in cyberspace. And the commission put forth a number of recommendations aimed at doing just that. Some of those made it into law in the 2021 NDAA, notably, as Greg mentioned, the creation of a Senate-confirmed National Cyber Director position, as well as other important legislative changes. There were other recommendations that the commission is continuing to advocate for that overlap and dovetail pretty nicely with the work of the New York Cyber Task Force. And so I would say that overall, our work on the New York Cyber Task Force really validated in a strong way the Solarium Commission's emphasis on the role of the private sector in this sort of shared challenge, and on this vision of operational collaboration in particular between the government and the private sector. So moving beyond sort of information sharing models to more meaningful, institutionalized, and ongoing operational collaboration. And there are two Solarium Commission recommendations in particular that I saw as being a sort of common thread throughout the scenarios and the process of the New York Cyber Task Force, which we then sort of elaborated on in our own recommendations. And so the first of those, I would say, is the creation of a joint cyber planning office within CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which was established in law in the 2021 NDAA. And so the Joint Cyber Planning Office, as sort of envisioned by the Solarium Commission, was meant to facilitate comprehensive planning of defensive cybersecurity campaigns, including both the federal government and the private sector as stakeholders. And then the second Solarium recommendation that sort of dovetailed really nicely with the New York Cyber Task Force's work was the creation of a joint collaborative environment, which did not make it into the 2021 NDAA. And the joint collaborative environment was meant to be a central hub for fusing information from the government and the private sector at both classified and unclassified levels where appropriate about cyber threats, malware forensics, data from network monitoring programs, and so on, to enable a common picture of the threat environment and shared situational awareness. And so, you know, what the New York Cyber Task Force learned through workshopping these scenarios and stress testing these recommendations as well as others is that while there has been important progress, the US does not yet have all of the right tools and processes in place to enable real operational collaboration. And that's because being prepared to sort of respond and sort of fight together shoulder to shoulder, as Greg mentioned, if a major cyber incident does occur, requires figuring out sort of on the back end in advance how different stakeholders are supposed to actually work together during a crisis. This is what informs the task force's recommendation about the National Cyber Response Network to have a common concept of operations around likely scenarios, shared situational awareness during a crisis, the integration of capabilities so that stakeholders are more interoperable, and so on. But what I would really emphasize is that for all of those things to be effective, so for the National Cyber Response Network to be as effective as possible when it's activated to respond during a crisis, it has to be sort of institutionalized and enable continuous collaboration on a routine basis between the government and the private sector before that crisis or contingency takes place. And I would say that some of the sort of enabling recommendations that the New York Cyber Task Force put forth in the report are really critical to get at that sort of routine day-to-day collaboration, so that if and when a big incident occurs and the response network is sort of activated, it's better prepared to do the job that it's meant to do. And the two I would highlight first would be establishing the ongoing training and exercise programs that include both the government and the private sector, so that stakeholders learn how to work together and to iterate working together before a crisis happens. And this would include the shoulder-to-shoulder joint training, the routine exercising of joint playbooks, so that response teams don't have to waste valuable time sort of figuring out how to implement the playbooks because they haven't been exercised, and then sort of incorporating lessons learned into future iterations. And then the second critical recommendation, which is an enabling one, but I would say is really important, is the integrated information network, which enables the sharing of threat information in real time with participation from the government and the private sector. And this is similar to the Solarium Commission's vision for a joint collaborative environment, but the vision of the integrated information network sort of goes beyond that, and includes not just sort of the rapid synchronous threat and information sharing, but also the co-located analysis with government and private sector analysts sitting together side by side, working on shared threats. And so it's sort of this vision that is a really critical element of the overall the New York Cyber Task Force's sort of vision for operational collaboration. And I would just add that I think one piece that we don't often talk about as much is sort of the strategic warning piece. And we focus on how we sort of respond and sort of address and manage a crisis when it happens. But an important part of that is being able to sort of anticipate and have strategic warning of impending adversary activity. And so it's not just the sort of response to a contingency, but all of the things that have to happen on a day-to-day basis to be better prepared for it, and also to better anticipate it. And that also has to involve participation by the private sector, not only because the private sector sees threat actors operating on their networks on a routine basis, but also because they have sort of unique industry-specific knowledge and expertise that can help identify and give context and meaning to what those indicators should be. So I think overall, there are a lot of synergies between the Solarium Commission's work, the New York Cyber Task Force's work, and I really look forward to both of those initiatives' efforts to sort of move the ball forward and really push things in the right direction to get at this better operational collaboration. So with that, I turn it back to Dean Jano and look forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Borga. That was a tremendous set of remarks. Appreciate it a lot. I'd like to invite Michael Daniel to offer his perspectives. As mentioned, he's president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. We have a lot of experts on the webinar with us today, but we also have some students who might not be aware of your organization. And you're just a very important group of cybersecurity industry experts. And so hearing your perspective on this report will be very important. If you could also educate us all on how your group engages with these questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Dean Janow, and Greg, also thank you for your leadership on the task force, and to my panelists and all the other task force members that put a lot of time into this project. So just to start with the Cyber Threat Alliance, we are a nonprofit that enables cybersecurity providers. So cybersecurity companies, telecommunication companies, platform providers, those that provide cybersecurity services to others. We specialize in enabling those companies to share threat intelligence with each other at speed, at scale, in an automated fashion. And to do that thing that Greg was talking about, build that trust and confidence at a human-to-human level by exchanging intelligence at human speed as well. So we bring together currently 32 of the world's leading cybersecurity companies into a collaborative fashion to share threat intelligence so that we can make the overall digital ecosystem safer. So that's really the perspective that I bring from managing that effort to collaborate across all those different companies. And I should say they're global. I've already seen some questions about global nature in the Q&A, and CTA is global. We have companies that are headquartered in 10 different countries around the world. So I think that's very important. I think the perspective that I'll offer about why I think the task force's work is so important and this focus on operational collaboration is really driven by two broad factors. One is the trends that we see in cyberspace that have been ongoing for several years, and the other is the nature of cyberspace itself. So the first set, the trends that you see in cyberspace, how is the threat evolving? And I would say that the threat has been evolving for us in 5 different ways. One is that it is getting broader. Cyberspace is the only domain that I know of that is growing. On a daily basis, we keep hooking more and more stuff up to the internet. So literally on a daily basis, there is more cyberspace. That's not true of, land or air or sea or even near Earth orbit, right? But every day there's more cyberspace. And that's a profound fact that changes how we have to think about this environment. Second, it keeps growing more and more diverse, right? When people like Greg and Admiral Blair was talking about 25 years ago, when we first started working in cybersecurity, we were worried about wired desktops. Now we've got to worry about everything from your refrigerator to your car to your industrial control system to a water plant in Florida being hooked up to the internet. Third, it's become much more prolific. These threats have all become very prolific. Cyber criminals have figured out that it's a great place to do business. Nation states have figured out that cyberspace is a great place to pursue espionage and other national security goals. Terrorists, domestic, violent extremists, you name it. Anyone has discovered that cyberspace is a great place to do their work. And then the fourth trend is that it's more dangerous. 15 years ago, we might have been discussing website defacement, like as a problem. Like, when was the last time that we worried about website defacement as a serious threat? Like, we have changed into a world where we are actually worried about public health and safety, about people's lives being at risk as a result of what happens in cyberspace. And then lastly, I would say the things that would have been minorly annoying 20, 25 years ago are now organizationally catastrophic. We are dependent on cyberspace in a way that is growing continually. So those 5 trends make for a very, very dangerous environment. But then I would also say that cyberspace is fundamentally different than a lot of the other environments that we deal with. It is a discontinuous nodal network that operates at light speed. And that means that the physics and math of cyberspace are different than the real world. And that in turn means that most of our mental models about how the real world, physical world works, we keep trying to map onto cyberspace and they don't work. So we have issues about how the government should be organized. And we think about things like border security. I mean, there are borders in cyberspace, they just don't match our physical borders very well. And so because our mental models don't work, the way that we have been approaching and the way our organizational models don't work, the way that we have typically approached dealing with cyberspace hasn't worked as well as it should. And so for those set of trends that I was talking about, the way that cyberspace is growing more dangerous, and because our old mental models don't work, in order to actually address this threat, we need some new models for organization. And that's where this operational collaboration concept comes in. So just as at the beginning of the 20th century, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the true industrialization of society, we built a whole bunch of new institutions, not just in the government, although we did do some of that, but in the private sector as well, to deal with the realities of the Industrial Revolution. We need to do the same thing in cyberspace. And so that's what that operational collaboration idea is about. It's about not just, as Erica said, it's not just about sharing information. but it's about actually moving into operational collaboration. And what do we mean by that in a pointed fashion? It means not just operating in our respective silos, but it means, in fact, operating together to achieve effects in time and cyberspace that are synchronized. And that means synchronizing activities between the government, between governments, and the private sector in a way that we're profoundly not used to. And this means building whole new types of relationships between the government, between governments, between different levels of government, between the government and the private sector in ways that we're not used to. And so I'll just close my set of remarks by saying all of this is going to be hard. If it were easy, in fact, we probably would have already done it, and we wouldn't need to assemble, groups with as much depth of talent as we saw in the New York Cyber Task Force, for example. So this is going to be hard, and it's going to require a lot of really in-depth conversation from a lot of different perspectives in order to get the structures right, in order to get the laws and policy right, in order to get the culture right that we need to build. So while I am optimistic that we can do it, we should not underestimate the challenges. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, Dean Janow.
Thank you very much. Everyone who's speaking today served on this task force and has really contributed a lot. And I want to thank you, Salila, for bringing your expertise to the work of the task force. I failed to mention in my introduction that she was also in the Justice Department as well as on the Judiciary Committee. So you have an enforcer's experience that you brought to the private sector now at Facebook. Clearly the kind of threat environment there is potentially very large. And so this must be, front and center concern for you every single day. So please share your perspectives that you bring to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Dean Janow, and thank you to the panelists, and thank you to everyone who is dialed in. It's really great to see the level of engagement here. This report is the product of more than a year of collaboration and deep thinking by people from across the public sector, the private sector, civil society, and I think that it's a great model for what we've been talking about. And I wanted to sort of dig a little bit deeper on some points that Erica made, that Greg made, that Michael made, and that Dean Janow made in terms of the human element here. And, when we talk about the cyber landscape and how diverse it is, and we talk about how a high schooler in Florida can engage in a compromise of a major social media platform, which happened last summer on the eve of the US presidential election, and there was uncertainty if it was a state-backed actor or not. There is this uncertainty in terms of knowing what a threat might be out there. And unless you have these sort of trust-based fora established and ongoing and sort of in steady state, that position of uncertainty is just a huge level of risk to carry, and it makes mitigation of the threat and neutralization of the threat and understanding of the threat extraordinarily difficult. And so when we talk about operational readiness, what flows from that is trust, and what flows from that is confidence, both from the people who are engaged in building that trust, but also the people who are impacted, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a school system, whether it's a small business. Speaking from the Facebook experience and looking at an example recent in our time and sort of specific to the US, but also applicable globally, we had the US 2020 presidential cycle. And there was a lot riding in terms of engagement with major platforms, as well as engagement with law enforcement, engagement with the news media, etc. And trust was a huge issue. And the information environment was complex. There were active and ongoing and varied sources of information, sort of complicating that. And also sort of the threat landscape was different, where you had cyber criminals as well as sort of disinformation actors kind of merging in terms of taking advantage of a lot of people being online with COVID and just the sort of complexity of the political landscape. And what was an operational readiness that fostered trust that helped us to sort of overcome the challenges of the moment? And Facebook, along with several of its tech sector partners and collaborators and peer companies, engaged with law enforcement, engaged with civil society to make sure that there was active communication about the threats that were on radar, the threats that were emerging, and also sort of potential adversarial evolution of threats that weren't necessarily known in, for example, the 2016 election cycle, but might be coming up. And as a result of that steady state of active communication and building that trust over time, which was the case through like monthly meetings, weekly meetings as we got closer in time to the elections environment, we were able to sort of have open channels, which enabled us not just to be reactive, but proactive. And I think that that was another point that I think is important here, is that often we talk about cyber threats and like, we need to know who to call in order to respond. But like when you have this operational readiness, you are always able to communicate in real time about things that are on radar, that are coming, that are emerging threats, and build the resilience in advance of an attack. And I think that that posture is one that is critical when we look at how much of the world is online right now because of a global pandemic that we're all in the middle of right now. And so this concept of adversarial threat readiness is one that is reliant on trust, reliant on the operational collaboration, and absolutely critical to be able to survive and thrive in the sort of current plugged in culture that we're in globally right now. And the fact of the matter is, the connectedness of the world right now is amazing. The fact that we're having this webinar and still able to do it, and we're not live in person, you know, in a conference room or in an auditorium at Columbia University, that's amazing. And I think we can't forget that part of this vigilance is to enable the brilliance of technology and the brilliance of American-led innovation to really shine not only nationally, but globally, bringing families together that have been separated by the pandemic, enabling small businesses to ship goods around the world. And so there's a real economic imperative to maintaining this trust. And it is really based primarily and foremost on sort of the human connections that we make and that we sustain through these established bodies. So it's been an extraordinarily rewarding and worthwhile investment for Facebook to have been engaged with the work of the New York Cyber Task Force. And I look forward to the discussions around, you know, what we can do better. But clearly, you know, having these connections cross-sector and making sure that they're on a regular cadence is critical for us to be able to sort of succeed collectively and achieve goals together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we're starting to get some good questions, and I just want to invite others who are watching to send their questions in. But why don't I get us started with, and also bring Admiral Blair into this conversation as well. I think one of the, when you look at our recommendations and the enabling recommendations, I think one of the obvious questions you might have as a reader is, well, how far away are we from having something that looks like an effective response network? I mean, it sounds very logical, rational. How hard is that? Michael Daniel said this will be hard, but but I think you all feel it's hard, but it's doable, and we should do it. So how far are we from, how far away are we, and what do you see as the major obstacles to creating an effective response network? Anyone like to get us started?
So I'd lay out sort of two dimensions of how far away we are. One is, you know, this shoulder to shoulder notion that we have about how this will work will require a lot of change of, you know, laws and procedures, but also culture, and I think, having worked with some of the people in the task force on this, including Michael and Erica, the notion of the national security community working really deeply on proactive threat identification, strategic warning, as Erica said, in a real-time fashion with the private sector is counterculture to how we've organized information flows and how we've done national level planning. So that will take, that's going to take time. It's going to take senior leadership commitment. The progress that I've observed that we made has been at those moments when senior private sector and national security leadership have joined together and started things like we have now something called the Analysis and Resilience Center, which was focused initially from the financial services sector. So we have some initial models of this, but there's a lot of work to be done progress-wise. And then the other thing that I've been concerned about for quite a long time is just we're going to need a significant amount of more resources. So, I mean, there's an investment level that is, I would say half an order of magnitude or even an order of magnitude larger, largely for the response network, but for other cyber defense functions for the nation. But I think about, as a former military officer, what we spend on training exercises and readiness, and how much of the military budget actually goes into things besides aircraft and tanks, but into training centers that allow us to interoperate really well, again, with just between military services, but also with other elements of the US government and with allies. And that those capabilities, that ability to respond quickly and effectively in that realm, is based on very, very significant investments, because our nation's security is dependent on it. In some ways, global, ability to function all across the internet are dependent on it. So I think while we have a lot of good examples, and I think, Mara, to your point, we know what we need to do, we're going to have to change some culture, some rules, which has not gone easily in the last 20 years of having been there when we stood up DHS. And then we're going to have to really invest. So that's my perspective.
Thank you. Admiral Blair.
My experience in this area is that you proceed to make progress at the pace of the outrageousness of the crisis that you deal with as you go along. It's really hard to get organizations to move when there's not really the pressure of something having gone bad recently. And Salila mentioned the success in safeguarding the 2020 elections. I think that built on what was done in 2018. And I think that community of organizations that have responsibilities and capability in that area is doing well and will continue it. I think the really important one of the really important recommendations from this conference is to try to create artificial substitutes for crises in the form of exercise scenarios that force everybody to go through the same sort of thinking process that they do when they hit a real crisis, take the lessons that they learn from it, and actually, as Greg said, spend money on getting better at it in the absence of it actually happening to you. So I really think we have got to not only take advantage of the crises that hit us to get ourselves tougher and more resilient in those areas, but we have to create some artificial crises in areas that we know are wide open and really need work to put resources in to make those better. And I think that's how we'll make progress.
Thank you very much. Erica.
Thank you. Yeah, so I concur with my colleagues about the challenges and the hurdles that exist in implementing these recommendations, but I just thought I'd offer some optimism to counter all of the pessimism. And I have to say, kind of bringing it back to Admiral Blair's point about sort of needing to create a crisis in order to galvanize support around major and difficult changes. I do think that's right. Although I have been really pleased in the past few years, and I am certainly much newer to this space than a lot of my fellow panelists, but there seems to be a growing recognition, even in the absence of a single decisive event, that there are some serious changes that need to be made, and that those will also require, to Greg's point, an investment of resources. And Admiral Blair's comment just reminded me of the early days of the Solarium Commission, where we brought in some academics to sort of brief us on what are the conditions under which congressional commissions succeed or not, accepting the reality that most commissions end up, unfortunately, being just, door stoppers. And it turns out that being a crisis commission, like the 9/11 Commission, is a really good indicator of being able to affect positive change. But I have to say that I do think we've seen a lot of progress, particularly on the Hill, in terms of being willing to tackle some difficult challenges from a legislative side to address cybersecurity. And I think that we haven't been forced into sort of responding to a crisis situation to do that. So that's just my, to borrow Corey Shockey, putting on the tiara of optimism. For those of you who listen to her on podcasts, I thought I'd offer that sort of positive spin. I think there has been a lot of improvement, recognizing that there's a lot of room for continued improvement.
Thank you very much. Michael, would you care to weigh in on this question?
Sure. I mean, I think that many of the elements of the network are there. That there are organizations like Cyber Threat Alliance or the National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance or the Cyber Defense Alliance in the UK that can serve as some of the private sector hubs for this. There's the ISACs that were mentioned. So there are elements of this system that are in place. There are organizations that help facilitate global network of CERT and other kinds of responders. So, and you've got the experience that, like Salila mentioned, in the election of those groups coming together. So I think what the good news, to borrow Erica's optimism frame of mind, the good news is a lot of the components are there. What we're trying to do is assemble them in a new fashion to build some new relationships and to scale them up so that they can operate at a much higher pace and scale and have the impact on the adversary that we want. So I think that's, we're kind of at that midpoint, and that's another reason why this report is so timely, is a lot of those components have been coming together, and now what we're talking about is how to put them into an organizing framework and move forward with it.
Thank you very much. And I'll just reiterate that, the report identifies those elements that need to be brought together, but doesn't say exactly how Washington should organize itself, nor exactly how industry should organize itself. I think one of the puzzles is you see great expertise in some sectors like financial services that has had, constant exposure to attacks, but how much cross-sectoral collaboration, what are the mechanisms for doing that, et cetera, feels underdeveloped. Well, I think we're at a point we should let our very active and interested audience come in a little bit. And I think one of the questions asked is, and I'm going to paraphrase, some of these are long, although very thoughtful, is really what's the potential for global collaboration? And implicitly, why are we focusing in this report only on national? And I would just observe on that question, it's very hard to do things globally unless you know what you're doing nationally. And you see that in policy area after policy area. But let me invite us all to reflect on why is there a national focus as against global here?
I can start, but certainly would want others. I'm going to sort of take the perspective I had when I was, in the private sector, but in a global corporation, right? And we made a very conscious decision. The task force members here, for exactly the reason that you articulated, Merritt, that this is pretty complex. The U.S., I would say, has some sort of interesting, unique challenges in public-private. It stems from some of our strengths in terms of it being, a society with, strong legal foundations and, roles for government in the private sector. But in the national security realm, that creates challenges that I would say, meant that we needed to focus here. When I look at it from the perspective of a global corporation, you want the interfaces you have across the globe to be collaborative. Like if you're working in financial centers in London, Singapore, and New York, you want your interfaces with the UK government, the Singaporean government, and the US government to be similar, and you want them working together as well. So I think certainly for the situation where you're working with allies and friendly nations, this collaboration, operational collaboration, should take on a global or more than just a national layer. I think what we're hopeful with the task force work is it can help create a model, right? And in one where that when we work across borders, that the private sector is also confident it can work across borders with governments. So the reason we focused was, as you described, so that we can work here on a model that hopefully we'll see working with others. And I will say from my personal experience that still around the globe, people look to the US for how to do public-private partnerships and lessons. So if we get it right here, I still, putting Erica's or Corey's, I had never heard of it, the tiara of optimism. I worked with Corey on the National Security Council staff, actually. With that tiara on, that, if we do it right here, I think we'll have some capacity to export that model to other places where, that we want it to be present. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, so I would, just to build on what Greg was saying there, I would also say it's a matter of scale and complexity too. One of the lessons that I learned very profoundly at one point during my time on the National Security Council was, we were doing a joint exercise between the US government, the UK government, and our respective financial sectors. And so we were going to have this video conference, with over the Treasury building, and we were going to connect with the UK government, and we were going to bring in our private sector. And the most amazing thing was that the video conference actually worked, and actually came together. This was pre-Zoom days, so that was actually the most astounding thing. But when the video conference came up, and I was looking at my counterpart in the UK, and he said, we have representatives from all of our financial services companies here in the room with us. All of them, all 42 of them. We have 13,000 in the United States. You couldn't even fit them in a stadium. And so that really just drove home the scale that we have to operate at in the United States is unlike most of the other nations on the planet. And so there is an element to which we have to get our own house in order before we can engage effectively with the rest of the world. Now, that said, this is profoundly an international issue. And I never worked a single issue in this space in my time in government that was purely domestic. And all of these will have an international flavor to them. And if we want to talk about going after cyber criminals, yes, there are some that live here in the United States, and there's infrastructure here in the United States, but there's a lot of them that live overseas. If you want to talk about our nation state adversaries, they're overseas. So this is profoundly going to have to be an international effort. But as Greg said, if we get the foundation right here, then that will make us much more effective at engaging internationally and working across those international boundaries.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we collect a few more questions? And I noticed that one of our early cyber fellows has asked a question. Thank you for doing so. Who was running this program 5-6 years ago. And he asked the question, observes that a silver lining from this COVID-19 has been an increased awareness about the importance of cybersecurity and insurance markets actually are hardening. They're starting to become real cyber risk insurance. Does this report offer a view that cyber risks will be mitigated as a consequence of this awareness and prioritization, or just our response capacity has increased? Do you see a risk mitigation from these measures?
I think that's a great question because it opens a lot of real-time issues that we're facing. So Michael mentioned the point about the election, right? We had this election and it was this unifying force and everyone was sort of, we are going to make sure that this is completely focused on integrity and an outcome that people can have full faith and credit in. And right now we're in the midst of this global pandemic and industries like the insurance industry are responding. Cyber readiness is a thing that, you know, even small time company owners are thinking about, as well as, you know, major multinational global corporations are thinking about, but we don't necessarily have sort of a common unifying force. And so when you think about the New York Cyber Task Force and the proposals that it puts forward, the connectedness of the group and the focus on scenarios is critical for having a unifying force on potential threats that might be emerging and keeping the toolkit sharp in terms of being ready. And I think that when you look at the diversity of threats that have been coming forward, everything from scams on selling masks that can keep you safe against COVID to, you know, things as massive as solar winds, there's this extreme range. And so there's uncertainty, and one of the questions touches on this, there's uncertainty in terms of, well, what do we focus on? Because there are so many things that are posing threats to us, and what can we possibly do? And so I wanted to come back to the sort of key proposals from the task force, which is to say, having a body come together and to sort of iterate on the fluctuating landscape of threats and focus and be precise and sort of scale potential responses is really important in order for us to continue to be effective. And the fact of the matter is, maintaining a state of high vigilance is extremely exhausting, in addition to sort of running one's business, taking care of one's children, going grocery shopping, sort of the day-to-day things that we do as human beings. Like, that state of ultra alertness is truly exhausting. And so what something like operational and sort of steady state resilience builds is scalability and also long-term preparedness and readiness in a way that is really critical. But, you know, would love to hear from the other folks here to see what their thoughts are, given the sort of diverse fields that they've occupied. But that's sort of my takeaway coming off the heels of an incredibly intense and high alert period of time, which frankly is not sustainable at scale, given the other sort of day-to-day things that we have to face.
Thank you very much. Well, if you don't mind, I'll just keep going with a few questions because we have a lot of great ones here. And we have actually a former SIPA alumnus who's now an advisor consultant in cybersecurity, a former SIPA student, who's asking an interesting question, and I'll summarize because it's a bit lengthy, which is, you know, how do we avoid trying to boil the ocean? You know, he asks. In other words, is there, you know, there's so many stakeholders involved. What policy tools should the public sector utilize to corral a wide group of shareholders, stakeholders to advance our proposals here? So what do you think are the incentives that the government can use to make this happen? Greg?
I'm going to focus fairly narrowly inside what the report would say on this question, which is, you know, something we've been stressing a lot is the notion of identifying, you know, a set of contingencies, and that could be, you know, too many, you know, and there's a lot of out there. But if we set a prioritized set of, you know, contingencies or scenarios that we're going to do the extra investment and preparation for, that gives us a guide. Again, in other areas of disaster response planning and national security planning, you focus on a set of things that are highest priority, highest risk. So, if you started there and you had a limited number of things you were focused on, then the nodes in our structure for the report become more apparent for those specific contingencies, whether they're adversaries going after specific types of technologies or specific centers of gravity in our national critical functions. Then you use those sorts of things to get some degree of prioritization on what you do first, who's involved in that, and what investments you need to make. So it starts with that first sort of recommendation, which is to get a system in place to prioritize what things we're going to get ready for first. That would be, sort of, at least from the task force perspective, how I would tackle it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Michael?
Yeah, and Merit, I would just say that some of it is also the fact that, I would quote General Eisenhower here and say, the plan is nothing, planning is everything, in the sense that a lot of, we will inevitably not prepare directly for the specific crisis that will actually occur. But all of the preparation work, and this gets at what Salila was talking about, all that preparation work that we do will be applicable to whatever crisis we do end up facing. And so to me, that's why it's important not to avoid boiling the ocean. It's important to focus on developing those contingencies, plan for those, develop those capabilities, knowing that the thing that we're likely to face won't look anything like what the actual contingency that we planned for is, but it will turn out that what we built is able to deal with it. The other thing I would just say is we also can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. In other words, that having one of the lessons that we've learned in within CTA about information sharing is that just because you can't share everything doesn't mean you shouldn't share something. And that some sharing is better than nothing. And don't let the fact that you can't get to the world of the perfect sharing stop you from doing some sharing right now. And so I think that same lesson is applicable in this broader area of operational collaboration.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Admiral Blair to comment, but if you don't mind, Admiral, a kind of related question in the mix here is, what are the implications, of that for the intelligence organizations to operationalize this kind of network concept? So I think that's kind of part of the same question, if you wouldn't mind sharing a few thoughts.
Right. I think what I have to say would help answer both of those questions. I think that the primary problem we have on the government side is that in our concern with protecting sources and methods and holding on to intelligence, we provide sort of information that is generalized, and so we stir up private companies, citizens, and businesses, and then we don't give them the specific information that they need to go fix the problem that we point out. I think on the government side, and it's mainly the job of intelligence, but not entirely. FBI has big responsibilities there, as well as does Homeland Security. We have got to find a way to be able to provide the exact intelligence threat data to the company that it really threatens. When you do that, my experience is that private companies are very anxious to cooperate. When you tell them you just need to worry about threats to the water purification systems of the world, all of the water purification systems across the United States, which, as Michael said, number in the thousands, go out and check their systems, but it doesn't really help them. Whereas in some of these specific instances that I've been involved in which we get good intelligence data that a particular American company is being threatened by a group of hackers from a specific country, and we go tell them, they take action. The cooperation is splendid. I'd say it's worst right now in the power generation sector, where there have been so many general warnings issued by the governments, but when the individual states and power utility regulators go to the government and say, "Is it us? Is it in Kansas? Is it in Connecticut? Is it in Florida? Is it in this rural electrical cooperative, or is it in this grid thing? What are you telling us about?" We say, "Sorry, can't tell you." And so I think on the government side, it's that we have an obligation for greater specificity. We have to find a way to get that specific information without blowing our penetration of the adversary networks that allow us to get this information. And then that'll really lead to stronger partnerships.
Thank you very much. Very, very helpful comment. Well, we have a lot of very sophisticated questions, and I thank all of you for them. We don't have time to turn to them, but I do want to give Greg Rattray a moment to bring us to a conclusion. And I want to thank all of our panelists and a really expert audience for being with us. It's been a great discussion. But Greg, what are your main points you want our audience and all of us to keep front of mind as we go forward with this report?
Well, one thing I came clear during the course of this afternoon is also, fundamentally, this is about the notion of saving cyberspace. And Salila, when we're talking about the fact, we're talking about all these bad things can happen, but we've had COVID and we're here on the Zoom being able to talk about it. We've got this essentially ever more important environment that we do need to make sure is protected. So, I want the people to, recognize that the report is about basically ensuring that a public-private good that we all increasingly need, is more robustly protected. And, I think, my take is that we've been clear that we haven't thought through the challenge, like the challenges could be really bad. To Admiral Blair's point, we don't want to wait until we have a disaster to figure out how to get better at this. We've got smart people that made up the task force, and the nation is capable of being proactively thinking about challenges. So we need to do that, and we need to get focused on the right sorts of things. We think the cyber response network is clearly identified as something that's necessary, and we'll need that investments. And I just wanted, Merit, to thank you and Evan Wolf, who was our co-chairs, all the task force members and the panelists today. I also want to just quickly thank the staff, in one person in particular, Ian Palekas, who has been my right-hand man as the executive director through this whole year of working on this, and felt like I wanted to recognize his role. But I really thank the audience. This is in some ways the start, right? Like, you do this work so that you have an impact on the world. We hope to continue the dialogue about the things we've raised from the task force going forward, and some of the things we've talked about, and certainly would seek anybody's engagement with us as we bring the messages forward. So with Merit, that's what I would leave us with this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I would just say, as a School of Public Policy, we are also focused on taking ideas out into the world. And I think this task force is a great piece of work. I thank you, Greg, and thank Jay Healy for his initiating the New York Cyber Task Force, and everyone on this panel today for your contributions and your own personal dedication and expertise to the subject matter. Thank you all very much. Thank you for being with us.